They aren't budging, sir.
They're not supposed to budge. Did someone try? That bunch from Grimmantle. A loud tisk issued from General Hor Darksteel. Coalition or not, it was a stupid idea to stick different clans together, especially when they were neighbors. He looked out into the nothingness beyond the range of his dark vision to where the battalion from Grimmantle filled their part of the encirclement. Since he hadn't heard anything from that direction, it must have been a stealthy breakthrough attempt. A dozen possible reasons for their deviation from the plan ran through his mind. Foremost among those was that they thought Darksteel's forces were trying to do the same thing. "We give them any reason to do that?" he asked. "No, sir," the captain said. "It's not as if we can afford it." Hor cast a baleful gaze at the floodlights lining the fortifications of their assigned hold. They expected Clan Feelhammer to be well prepared for their retaliation, but even he had underestimated how deadly of an edge generations of resentment and malice could forge. Storming the rebellious clan's defenses had cost the council dearly. For every meter of tunnel gained, dozens of battle thralls were lost. By the time they breached the city layers, half of the coalition army had been destroyed. It was all that they could do to drive the traitors into their holds and keep them there while reinforcements made their way over. "Check with the logistics officers," Hor told the captain. "Grimmantle isn't stupid enough to open a hole in our encirclement for no reason." "Probably." "Yes, sir." The captain saluted before turning to hurry off with his adjutant, disappearing up the street. Aside from his suspicions about Grimmantle's suspicions, there were several other plausible reasons for them making their move. The first was that they knew that their reinforcements were close. Secondly was the possibility that progress was being made elsewhere and they felt compelled to score achievements for themselves. Last, but not least, was that it was a feint. By goading Darksteel into making the mistake of assaulting the hold, Darksteel would be put into a disadvantageous position both militarily and politically. A few of those possibilities suggested that Grimmantle was better than Darksteel in various ways, so he didn't dwell too long on them. An hour later, the captain returned. "It took a bit to find the right officer, sir," the captain said, "but, by the sound of what he had to say, the main force has breached Feelhammer Citadel." Hor's lip curled into a sneer. "So that's it, huh? They think it's all over?" "It's not just Grimmantle," the captain said. "From what I saw along the way, the other clans are starting their own offensives, as well." "Any word on our reinforcements?" The captain shook his head. A low growl filled Hor's throat. Darksteel was supposed to have the most favorable logistics to Feelhammer, but then Feelhammer dropped a hold-down bridge on their fleet. Grimmantle had their bridge dropped, as well, but their staging area wasn't directly under it. As a result, the clans coming in from further away took Feelhammer's northeastern harbor instead. All Darksteel could do was go the long way through harder. They arrived late and their reinforcements would come in late. The other clans were more than happy to use that against Grimmantle to minimize their gains. A fundamental truth of the world was that those at the bottom were the last to get anything, if there was even anything left. All that they could do was accept reality or face the consequences of challenging it. Clan Feelhammer was foolish enough to do the latter, to the detriment of all of Khazan-ar. For that crime, the only thing that would remain of them was rubble. Hor crossed his arms and glared at the distant hold. He wouldn't be goaded into a position of even greater weakness. Grimmantle was welcome to bleed itself dry for military and political achievements. In fact, he should probably let them do just that. Once they were spent, Darksteel's forces could swoop in and take the greatest prizes. He turned to the line of thrall herds behind him. "Contact our captains," Hor ordered. "When Grimmantle commits to their real assault, limit our assistance to cursory skirmishes. Wait for my signal to make our move. Darksteel might bring their grievance with our actions to the council," the captain noted. Hor snorted. "Sure," he said. "Let them inform the world about how they were played for fools." Khazan-ar's order was a capricious bitch and the gods did not show any favor to those who were bested by their rivals. Hours passed without any change in the besieged hold, though the city streets around the encirclement were filled with activity. Tens of thousands of slaves were being marched by in chains, bound for the markets in other principalities. In the opposite direction came just as many coalition soldiers, which made sense considering ships inbound with reinforcements would be filled with slaves for the return trip. "Will we be able to make up for our losses here, General?" one of Hor's adjutants asked. In terms of bodies, Hor answered, obviously not. Fielhammer had about 700,000 residents and the slaves are being split a dozen ways. It'll come down to how the fallen holdings are being handed out. Ultimately, the strength of a clan lay with its population. The size of that population, in turn, relied on the availability of land and resources. Every principality was divided into a dozen or more holds, and each hold was essentially its own city with territories to make ensure self-sufficiency. So long as Darksteel could secure one hold for itself, they would be able to keep up with the other clans in the long run. I see, the adjutant said. That's why you issued those orders. Grimmantle's in the best position to gain 2 holds, so we need to make them lose 1 here. No clan wants anyone to gain more power than any other clan, unless it's themselves, so the entire council will shrug off their protests. If Grimmantle whines too much, they'll just annoy everyone else. The adjutant nodded slowly at his explanation. Hor let out a bored-sounding grunt. Science would be aware of it, but the common dwarf who entered the military didn't understand that generals were as much politicians as they were commanders. Generals who operated on a purely martial dimension would be buried by their rivals sooner or later. Another hour passed with no sign of Darksteel's reinforcements or word about the progress with Fielhammer Citadel. The first sign that anything was amiss came in the form of a snarl of slave traffic in the streets. Hor gestured at one of his adjutants. Go and find out what's causing that. Yes, sir. The woman jogged off in the direction of the city. Before she returned, one of the thrall herds approached him. General, she said, report from the left flank. Grimmantle's battalion is withdrawing. As in the battalion that's part of our encirclement? Hor asked. Yes, sir, the thrall herd answered. What in the God's name is going on? He peered at the enemy hold. Helmed heads could be seen in the arrow slits and poking over the battlements, but it didn't look like they were getting ready for anything big. Hor turned to examine the city behind them. Is the slave traffic stuck in the streets because something's causing a delay at the harbors? Lake Khazanah had more than its fair share of powerful monsters, but those were kept in check by the Deepwardens and their Kraken pets. Had tensions flared up between Darksteel and one of the other clans using the same harbor? That'd be fine if that's all it was. Sir. Metallic footfalls clanked up the steel steps as a runner scaled the command platform. The 4th and 5th battalions have just arrived from Harder, he said. They're crossing the bridge right now. Good, Hor said. At least we have someone to plug that hole in the encirclement. Hole, sir? Run back and tell those battalions to haul ass. We have a hold to take. Yes, sir. He turned his attention back to the enemy hold with a grim nod. With that, their claim was all but secure. Once they cleaned out the traitors, they could see what else there was to be gained. Sir. Hor looked over his shoulder in annoyance. The dispatched adjutant had returned. What now? Fighting's broken out in the mines, the adjutant said. That's why the slaves are all backed up. Fighting between which clans? It's not the clans, sir. It's the undead. Huh? The undead, sir. I heard you the first time. Do you mean to tell me that the coalition army is being held up by some zombies and skeletons? Undead around Khazanah were a common enough sight, but the clans had no problems keeping them under control. There was no chance of any real threat developing out of them as they couldn't collect to give rise to more powerful undead. I can't say, sir, the adjutant replied. None of the soldiers from the other clans would talk. I got that information from a battle thrall who somehow managed to flee from the mines. She couldn't even describe what it was that was attacking them. Even if that's taken at face value, Hor said, how did they get into the mines? The surveys from the council and our own people stated that Clan Fielhammer never tunneled past the divide. We kept it that way on purpose so we didn't have another incursion point to defend. As a general rule, no one tunneled past the divide, the kilometer-thick layer of impermeable rock that separated the upper realms and middle realms. Still, some dwarves dug too greedily and too deep, which in turn resulted in unwanted security expenditures to make sure what was down there stayed there. Was there an unreported tunnel somewhere in the Fielhammer mines? An extremely rich vein of rare metals would likely be kept a secret by the clan that discovered it. It felt like the only possible explanation, as the lands around Khazanah had no notable negative energy zones or civilizations that delved into necromancy. It was just some low-rung battle thrall, The adjutant shrugged. Since the other clans aren't saying anything, the situation should be under control. Then it's none of our business, for now, Hor agreed. Let's focus on our task. The 4th and 5th battalions should be here soon, and I want that hold conquered as soon as possible. If Grimmantle was having big enough problems that they needed outside help, they would have to come groveling first. Their clan had been getting too full of themselves in recent decades. His command platform shook as someone else rapidly scaled its steps. Sir. What? The newly arrived runner took a step back, his eyes going back and forth between the assembled officers. Spit it out. Hor barked. Orders from the council, sir. We're to prepare containment measures at the eastern underway entrance. If the council hasn't noticed, Hor grated, we're busy containing something else, right now. If the runner hadn't been one of his own men, he would have immediately suspected the missive to be a ruse. Maybe it still was. And what exactly are we preparing to contain? He asked. An undead army coming up the mines, the runner answered. Oh, an army now, is it? Since when can a whole damn army of undead get into Karzanar without so much as a warning from border security? They didn't say, sir. Hor idly ran his fingers through his beard as he considered the situation. He was highly skeptical of the notion that any undead army could represent a threat to Karzanar. Even the weakest principality had the power to destroy an entire cabal of elder liches. Thus, he could only believe that the true reason for the order was manipulation by the council. Due to the catastrophic opening move by Clan Feelhammer that sunk Darksteel's fleet, Darksteel's forces arrived late at more or less full strength. The other clans, however, had suffered substantial losses, pushing the unexpectedly strong defenders of Clan Feelhammer out of their mines and into their holds. By redeploying Clan Darksteel's army to fight the undead, the council meant to pare down Clan Darksteel's strength as it could be used to exert political pressure when the time to divide the spoils of their conquest came. Yet, there was little that he could do but acquiesce to the order. Even with the addition of 2 fresh battalions, the combined might of the coalition army could easily overwhelm Darksteel's forces. Hor blew out an angry sigh. Send word to the captains, he told the thrall herds. Move our siege works to the eastern underway entrance and set a perimeter. By the way, did the council say who's taking over here? No, sir, the runner replied. They didn't say. If he came back to find a Grimmantle army in their place, he would slaughter every single one of them. It took over 3 hours to get through the tens of thousands of slaves backed up in the city streets. Efforts had been made to divert them to harder, but moving that many wasn't simply a matter of turning around and walking the other way. By the time they reached the underway entrance, 5 other clans had taken positions nearby, forming a semicircle around the mouth of the passage. A lizard rider bearing the banner of the council stopped his mount in front of them. You're late, she said. Do you have anything useful to say? Hor walked past her without so much as a glance. These aren't mere skeletons and zombies, the rider pulled her mount alongside him. Hor glanced at the 5 armies pointing their amassed artillery at the entrance to the underway. You don't say. How did they get here in the first place? There are ways out through the bottom of the Feelhammer mines, the rider told him. Passages to dozens of old mines along the southern shore of the lake. And no one thought that they should be guarded. Those abandoned mines are inside our sphere of border posts. So any army trying to get to them should have been detected by our patrols, Hor filled in for her. This is the part where you tell me why that didn't happen. He didn't have to look at the woman to feel her angry glower. She was the eldest daughter of one of the western clans who had secured a prestigious position as a council agent. In times of war, however, she was nothing but a glorified runner. It wouldn't have mattered, she said after swallowing her ire. There too. Wouldn't have mattered? Hor looked at her incredulously. Wouldn't have mattered? How long should it have taken for them to prance their way in unchallenged from the border, girl? How much time to prepare did we lose? Which group of blithering incompetents allowed an army of the undead to reach a fucking principality without so much as a peep? Hor left the woman to fume on her mount. He took a quick look around the dimly lit encirclement before directing his battalions to take up their positions. After that, he turned to scan the buildings nearby, picking out the tallest one as his command post. It turned out that he wasn't the only one thinking the same thing. A command platform was already set up on the roof of the building. Hor glanced at the banners before stepping forward. Iron Fist. Dark steel. Iron-shod boots scraped against the metal floor of the platform as the old dwarf shifted to the side. His escort stood down, resting their hands atop the hafts of their great axes. Hor came up the steps to stand beside the Prince of Clan Iron Fist. "Sounds like you still have a way with the ladies," Prince Iron Fist said. "That girl's going to come around to either fuck you or kill you after this." "Or both," Hor grunted. "I take it you had more patience for her games?" "I have my own sources," Prince Iron Fist said. "A perk of being older than dirt. Of course, that doesn't mean she didn't try." Hor shook his head. Politics, intrigue, and plays for power were part and parcel of life in Khazar, but the young never understood where the lines were drawn. The woman acted as if it was just another day, trying to assert her superiority while selling the information that she possessed for as high a price as possible. "So," Hor said, "what are we up against?" "Death Knights," the elderly dwarf replied. "I believe you referred to them in plural." "An unknown quantity of Death Knights," Prince Iron Fist told him. "I don't know if they knew what they were up against at first, but the people in charge of securing the transportation corridors started out by treating them as they would any other threat. And now the mines are flooded with zombies." Hor placed a gauntleted hand on the platform's metal railing. "How much strength did we lose?" "We don't know for certain. Our best guess is 30,000 battle thralls assigned to the area along with the dwarves commanding them. Additionally, there were probably 20,000 slaves on their way down to the harbor or awaiting transport and the council reinforcements on their way up. The bright side was that they wouldn't be fighting the well-trained soldiers and battle thralls that were lost, only the weak zombies raised out of their corpses. Even if 100,000 zombies boiled out of the underway, the prepared artillery would pulverize them before they got anywhere. Were we able to get some war golems over? A good war golem was more than a match for a Death Knight. Their defense was about as good and they hit much harder. We sent a request, Prince Iron Fist said, but with the harbors lost, anything spared for us will be taking the long way around. Just like you did. Speaking of ways around, Hor said. How did we end up with an undead army up our asses? Prince Iron Fist's waist-length white beard shifted over his breastplate as he looked over his shoulder. There were no newcomers, so he turned his gaze forward again. It was Grimmantle, he said. Hor turned a frown on the old prince. As much as I like what I hear, Hor said, how do you know it's that and not the other thing? When we first received reports of the undead in the mines, we sent people to check the border posts. Turns out that the upper southeastern hemisphere may as well have been abandoned. The portion that Clan Grimmantle's responsible for. Did you hear about that new undead country that appeared overland recently? Every clan had at least a few exiles in Falagrim Feelhammer's company that roamed the realms above. Those exiles would do anything to return home, so obtaining information from them was a simple matter. The Sorceress Kingdom? Yeah. But I figured that Feelhammer would be the one to turn on us. There's no rule saying there can be only one, Prince Iron Fist said. Anyway, in this case, the evidence is clear enough. At some point, Grimmantle sent agents to negotiate with the Sorceress Kingdom and opened a hole in our defenses for those undead invaders. They want all of Khazar and they've sold the rest of us out for it. They've always been a greedy lot, Horse said. So the Grimmantle battalion we were stuck with at that hold. Recalled and disposed of. All of their forces on Feelhammer have been. Hor nodded. It was the best option, given the circumstances. They couldn't afford to have Clan Grimmantle betray them at a crucial moment, after all. The council should have sided with Feelhammer instead of Grimmantle during their dispute back then. No use in backtracking, the prince told him. This just means that we'll have two principalities to divvy up after everything's said and done. But first things first, how are we dealing with these undead invaders? It shouldn't be a problem as long as we can keep them bottled up here, the prince said. We'll chip away at them until they break apart and that's that. Even intelligent undead were fairly straightforward in their thinking, so the simple plan would probably suffice. The only thing that might foil the plan was some form of treachery that compromised the enclosure. Hor settled in as they made their preparations. Floodlights illuminated the underway entrance and the occasional round was sent flying at it as the engineers calibrated their siege weapons. Eventually, long after the last of the people fleeing the mines emerged, a group of figures shuffled into the light. Here they come. The zombies were cut down by the hail of quarrels flying down from the glacis raised around the underway entrance. Calls for the artillery to hold their fire drifted out of the darkness. If that's all that there is, Hor grumbled, who am I supposed to get angry at? It couldn't have been more than 3 dozen. Below, the helms of the surrounding arbalesters poked up into the floodlights as they peered at the yawning mouth of the underway. A minute passed, then another. And, then, the steady tread of metallic footfalls echoed from the void. Stomp. 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 Hor narrowed his eyes. How many sets of boots was that? Defenders of Tarzana. Prince Iron Fist's voice boomed over the coalition army. Let's give our guests a proper dwarven welcome. A row of crimson points appeared in the darkness of the underway. Loose. 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 The metallic clanks of hundreds of steel ballistae trailed after the call to attack. Their crews worked to reload the siege engines without stopping to watch their attacks fly home. From his vantage, Hor leaned forward intently as countless steel bolts twice the height of a dwarf were swallowed by the darkness of the passage. The echoing report of metal striking against metal was the only indication that they were hitting their targets. It would be nice if they came out so we can watch them get hit, Hor muttered. As if to oblige his request, a wall of black metal appeared, gleaming in the glare of the floodlights. A frown crossed Hor's beard. Hey, he looked to a deep warden standing sentry at the corner of the rooftop. How many is that? 12 shields, sir, the deep warden replied. No, wait. 12 more just appeared, forming a roof over the shield wall. They're turtling up? Since when did the undead do anything but engage in the most straightforward and rudimentary of tactics? A tremendous racket filled the air between the siege engines and their payloads striking the undead formation. If they want to sit there and eat ballista bolts until they fall apart, Prince Iron Fist said, that's fine by me. He had a point. If one just weathered attacks without any way to retaliate, then they would eventually be worn down. Still, the manifestation of an infantry formation from the undead set Hor ill at ease. I don't know if they have anything more up their sleeves, he said, but it'd be best if we didn't have to find out the hard way. Shouldn't we speed things up? We have plenty of alchemical rounds, Prince Iron Fist said, but those are ungodly expensive. Well, I suppose we can mix a few in. Throw in 1 elemental round for every 10 regular rounds. Death Knights aren't particularly strong or weak against anything, so rotate between them. Not long after, explosions of flame, frost, acid, and electricity blossomed against the shield wall. Hor crossed his arms as they watched the ongoing assault, stroking his beard in thought. If there's going to be more of this sorceress kingdom in the future, he said, we should start stockpiling holy ammunition. If we were defending ourselves against any old undead menace, maybe, Prince Iron Fist told him. But you've probably heard about how strong they are. They beat the fiend that conquered the Abelian Hills in less than a single season. With something like that, your best chance is to hope they decide there's something else more interesting to do and they forget you exist in the process. And if they don't? We sell them pots and pans. Hor snorted. Ridiculous. I'm serious, the prince shot him a look. A power like this is one you're better off appearing harmless and marginally useful to. Can't appear too useful or else they'll decide what you have is better off belonging to them. Not useful enough and you're forgotten, but probably dead, too. You make it sound as if this sort of thing has happened before. It's always what happens when the power gap is too wide between two sides. You're more than aware that it can happen between people. But it can also happen on a much larger scale. Most of you are just too young to hear it from those who lived through a similar situation. Why haven't you brought this up with the council? Because they're preoccupied with more immediate concerns. There's no getting through to you whelps when you're like that. As stupid as it sounded, he was probably right. In a world filled with intrigue and treachery, one would be brought low by the little things long before one could address the big ones, so everyone focused on what was immediately important. There was little point in worrying about any major problems if one was long dead before they could happen. A large explosion rocked the underway entrance as a trebuchet round filled with a mix of alchemist's fire and oil of impact shattered against the shield wall. That was a lot of giant toenails going up in smoke, Hor said. Shouldn't we be seeing some sign of the undead faltering by now? Powerful monsters and the like were undoubtedly daunting opponents in small-scale combat, but even a dragon would easily go down to the storm of steel and elemental devastation that their current targets were being subjected to. "Well, the undead keep going until they fall apart," Prince Iron First said. "And that shield wall prevents them from losing limbs and whatnot. They'll probably stand there until they crumble into dust all at once." A floodlight on the left side of the fortified enclosure went dark. Harsh dwarven shouts preceded the sound of a collapsing structure. Hor's head snapped over to the source of the disturbance. Orders to press the attack were punctuated by further losses in their illumination. He finally figured out what was going on when the platform of the closest tower was shattered by a steel ballista bolt, sending its crew of engineers tumbling to the street below. "They're throwing our damn bolts back at us," Hor said. "That can't be right," Prince Iron Fist frowned. "Well, they can throw them back, but Death Knights aren't anywhere near strong enough to destroy our siege works like that." The area around the underway slowly darkened as more and more light towers were destroyed. Dwarven siege engines continued loosing their rounds, but the crews would quickly lose their ability to aim through the deepening darkness. If the undead moved. "Arbalestas, load flares." Prince Iron Fist's voice thundered over the battlefield, "Keep the target area lit." Moments passed before smoking points of light filled the air, burying themselves in the cavern walls around the underway entrance. To Hugh's surprise, however, dozens of flares came flying back at them. "What?" A pained cry issued from below them. Hor looked over the edge of the platform. An engineer lay on the ground, a flare impaling his neck. Seconds later, the loaded ballista nearby exploded as it was shattered by a steel bolt. "Curse that Grimmantle." Prince Iron Fist grated. "They sent people to coordinate the undead. It would neatly explain everything that was going on." Grimmantle sent at least one commander to work with the undead in addition to a contingent of deep wardens to assist with reconnaissance tasks. "Reposition those siege engines." The prince barked. "Get." The ghostly figure of a dwarf woman rose through the steel floor plates of the platform behind the prince. Prince Iron Fist reached for his great axe, but the woman simply reached out, pushing her hand through his helmet. Prince Iron Fist froze with a furious snarl on his face. "Prince Feelhammer sends his regards," the woman said. A savage grin lit the woman's face. The old prince convulsed as his brain was crushed inside his skull. Hor's hand went for the mace on his hip. "Unincarnate. Damn it, what are the guards doing?" The woman spun around and kicked Hor in the chest, launching him off of the edge of the platform to fall headfirst to the streets below. Before he lost sight of the rooftop, he saw dozens of ethereal dwarves swarming over the guards. So it was Feelhammer all along? But what about the abandoned border defenses? What if? Hor sighed as the end of his 60-meter descent rapidly approached. It wasn't as if anything mattered anymore. A band of frost ringed the underway exit, creeping down the passage to stop a meter in front of Falagrim's feet. It was followed by a carpet of crackling electricity that advanced no further than the previous attack. The banging of metal against metal filled the air with a deafening clamor as the Death Knight formation weathered the unrelenting assault from the armies of Karsanar. Occasionally, a steel bolt clattered past him, sent skittering down the pavement by the heel of one of the Death Knights holding its position in the formation above. A dwarf scooped up the latest arrival when it came to rest against the first bend of the passage, giving it a quick examination before tossing it into one of the rail cars parked nearby. "How many is that now?" Falagrim asked. "Just over 200, my prince," the dwarf answered. Falagrim nodded with a grunt. Thus far, things have mostly gone as expected, and the few unexpected things turned out to be welcome events. After his forces butchered their way through the hordes of battle thralls sent to wear them out, they broke into the underway, cutting off the coalition army from the harbors below. Not only did they have the fortune of setting upon thousands of poorly positioned council troops in transit to the city lair, but they also came across thousands of Feelhammer clansmen who had been captured and were being transported to the slave markets in other parts of Karsanar. Now, not only did he have an army of undead, but also an army of dark dwarves eager to return the humiliation visited upon them by the council. For the time being, they were undergoing reorganization in the reclaimed mines before being set to their respective tasks. A wave of heat washed down the passage, blowing lightly at his beard. The course of events was all too predictable, though it wasn't because his opponents were stupid. They were simply limited to a handful of useful tactics given their present situation, and they weren't fools who would deliberate over their options for too long. Once they understood what they were up against, all they could do was swallow their losses and withdraw as quickly as possible. Their next move was to prepare a battlefield where they could confront the undead at range. Making their stand at the underway entrance was the optimal choice, as it was where the greatest amount of force could be brought to bear on a single point. The council forces didn't disappoint. Going by the sheer volume of artillery rounds being sent their way, they had several hundred siege engines set up to repel their unwanted guests. Unfortunately, most of the ballista bolts ended up bent or broken, so it was taking a while for Falagrim's side to stockpile ammunition. A death priest came forward, its dark vestments sweeping lightly over the pavement. It raised its corrupted censer in the direction of the shield wall. Mass open wounds. What damage had accrued over the past 5 minutes was instantly reversed as a wave of negative energy washed over the formation. That was probably another thing that the council wasn't expecting. The undead, while known for commonly having draining attacks, usually didn't come with their own healers. With the additional mana regeneration provided by the maintenance crew, the council coalition would run out of ammunition without anything to show for it. With the situation stable, Falagrim returned to the tunnels below. The first large chamber on the way down, a garage for the mining network's trains, had been repurposed into a temporary command post and rest area for his living troops. He found Agni standing around a heatstone lamp with a human girl and her menagerie. "Our new companies are starting to form," Agni said. "We have plenty of equipment to go around and no shortage of volunteers, but there are too few with officer experience." "That's to be expected." Falagrim pulled a flask of water from his belt. "They're mostly going to keep the city in order while the undead do most of the fighting, so it shouldn't be a problem. Good thing too, since we barely have any clerics." "What have you gathered about what's going on in the city?" "A purge, basically," Agni replied. "They were in the process of breaking up the clan and shipping them off to the slave markets when we broke in from below." "How long have they been in the city for?" "About a day. Our people fought like hell to keep them out. They took who they could afford to into the holds to dig in for an extended siege." "And the disposition of the council forces?" Falagrim asked. "Unknown," Angie answered. "They're fighting city by city, street by street. Anyone who was captured only knew about their local situation. Our information goes about as far as Hardaway, so it looks like they've only made it a third of the way across the principality. From this end, at least." Falagrim dredged up the memories of his home, recalling the layout around the underway entrance. "Is the closest hold still a kilometer west of here?" "Deepingstone, yes." He wrinkled his nose at the mention of the name. "We should skip over that one," he said. "They'll come after you anyway," Agni noted. There was no arguing that, but his mind worked to figure out how to avoid them anyway. Their next move after shattering the council's attempted encirclement was to head for Fielhammer Citadel, breaking the sieges of the holds along the way. The Citadel probably had the strongest council forces arrayed against it, so putting an end to them would transform the rest of the battle into a giant cleanup operation. "Have the Elder Liches completed their assignment?" Falagrim asked. "They are still in the process of conveying your rangers to their designated locations," the sergeant in the camp said. "Survey teams have located multiple points ideal for incursion along the way." "What have you seen of the council's forces?" "The disposition of enemy troops is sparse. Several major fortified structures appear to have been abandoned entirely to support the containment of our forces." He wondered how long it would take the Fielhammer defenders to come out on their own. They would naturally be wary of the ruse to lure them out of their positions, but, at the same time, the lot of them would be thirsting for blood. The leading crack of an explosion ripped down the underway and into the chamber. A scream filled the air as the human ducked and hugged herself, trembling like a leaf. "I take it you'll be staying here?" "No," the human replied. "I'm coming with you." She clearly wasn't cut out for the battlefield, so what was the point in putting on a brave front? "I actually had a question," the human said as she rose and smoothed out her skirts. "It had better not be a stupid question," Falagrim said. "The soldiers that you captured on the way here. I saw them getting herded into cells. When I asked what was going to happen to them, the people said that they would become slaves. Is that true?" "Aye, that's true. What of it?" He took a long draught out of his flask. It sounded like a stupid question. "Aren't they your people? Your countrymen?" The sound of Falagrim's coughing echoed from the walls and the ceiling. Is there something wrong with your head, girl? He croaked. I don't know if you've noticed, but all those Fieldhammers being led down to the harbor were also being shipped off as slaves. The way that it sounded on the way down here was that slavery was a thing for everyone but dark dwarves, while the dark dwarves took up positions of power. We don't discriminate. Don't human countries enslave their own citizens? They do. And what happens to captives taken in war? Falagrim wiped off his beard while the human visibly gathered her thoughts. If a captive is valuable enough, a noble or a valuable retainer, for instance, they would be ransomed back to their allies. And if they aren't? Falagrim asked. If they aren't? The human hesitated for a moment. Honestly, Riestais hasn't been in a war that has resulted in captives since it outlawed slavery. But back when House Vaself was still unifying the country and conflicts between humans were common, captives that couldn't be ransomed were either sold as slaves or taken as them. With that bit in your history, he said, I have to wonder why you asked your question in the first place. I'm not sure myself, the human admitted. Maybe it's because I thought that the first step of turning from a system of slavery was the decency to at least not enslave one's own people. But it seems that nearly everywhere I turn, the world is a horrible place. That's where you're wrong, Falagrim told her. The world just is. If you think that it's the way that it is for the express purpose of offending your sensibilities, then you're just full of yourself. The frequency at which logical contradictions spewed forth from the human's mouth strongly suggested that she lived in a society where people were accustomed to living a life filled with problematic falsehoods without facing the consequences for them. He struggled to imagine just how coddled a society would have to be to reach that state of delusional willfulness, however. My prince, a dwarf came in and lowered his head. The rail car's just about full. Falagrim looked away from the unhappy-looking human and left the chamber. Out in the underway, several makeshift companies of his clansmen had already collected. Closer to the city entrance, the 4 death warriors included in the undead lease were already picking out ballista bolts, making a show of testing the weight and balance of their selections. Any changes at the front? Falagrim asked. We have noted no major alterations to the enemy force's disposition, the Elder Lich Sergeant reported. The infantry squads continued to maintain nominal operations. Then it's time to force some alterations, Falagrim said. Start by taking out those floodlights. Understood. The first of the Death Warriors cocked a ballista bolt over its shoulder like a javelin, taking a running start before hurling it over the shield wall toward the fortified encirclement 500 meters away. Falagrim squinted into the distance, but it was impossible to make anything out in the blinding glare. Get anything? The summon positioned over the area reports that the projectile struck a building behind the target. Well, keep going. They're sending us more ammunition than we're throwing back at them. It took several attempts before one of the Death Warriors found its mark. Falagrim nodded in satisfaction as a beam of light pivoted up toward the cavern ceiling as one of the towers collapsed, going dark when it crashed into the street. The Death Warriors eventually established a mostly steady rhythm, sending projectiles flying out of the underway at a rate of 1 every 2 seconds. Occasionally, a large alchemical round would catch one of the Death Warriors as they were making their attack and they would pull back for healing. You have anything to deal with that? Falagrim asked. The enemy has not been favoring any particular element, the Elder Lich Sergeant answered. Figures. Naturally, if an army was shown to favor a particular element, its opponents would employ the appropriate abjurations and enchantments as a countermeasure. This showed that, as powerful as the Sorceress Kingdom appeared to be, they were still beholden to the same rudimentary combat principles as everyone else. As the minutes passed, the glare from the floodlights gradually diminished. The intensity of the Council's assault did not, however, and that was the next thing they would need to address. That part of their strategy had already been laid out in advance, so it was simply a matter of waiting. When the last few of the light towers started to go down, dozens of flares streaked toward the underway entrance. The Death Warriors faltered in visible confusion, sending looks over their shoulders at him. Falagrim snorted. Those aren't ours, obviously. Eventually, flares from the Fieldhammer Deep Wardens flown in advance to the cavern walls above the underway entrance started coming down, marking the siege weapons straight out from the tunnel entrance. The Death Warriors wasted no time pummeling the Council lines, breaking down constructs and skewering crews of Dwarven engineers 2 and 3 at a time. At long last, Shouts of confusion started drifting over from the enemy soldiers across the field. "Now, what will you do?" The answer, apparently, was nothing. Artillery rounds kept coming in, just as ineffective as before. He supposed it couldn't be helped. The Council army probably never expected to get into an artillery duel with the undead, never mind losing one. Once the artillery emplacements in front of them were destroyed, the shield wall advanced slightly to give the Death Warriors space to attack the positions to the sides. It took a full hour from there for the Council's attacks to finally cease. "What took them so bloody long to withdraw?" Falagram muttered. "Don't tell me you expected me to fail." Velgarth appeared in front of him with a hurt look. "Who were we up against?" Prince Ironfist was in command, his daughter told him. Hoard Darksteel was there with the old fossil. They had Shadowforge, Cindermount, and Axholt making up the rest of the encirclement. "Any idea how many survived to withdraw?" "Around 90% of their forces, maybe. They were sticking to their orders for a good long while after I killed off their generals. The officers finally got a clue around the time they lost half of their siege engines." "Which way did they go?" "Away," Velgarth shrugged. "Law and them should have the specifics once they get back to us." In other words, there wasn't any sense of unified command any longer. Or at least for the time being. Given how things usually went between Dark Dwarves, it would take a long time to consolidate and reorganize with the generals disposed of. Falagram turned his head toward the Elder Lich Sergeant. "It's time to stir the pot," he said. "Proceed with the next step of Phase 2. Acknowledged. There was no point in not taking advantage of their enemy's disorganized state. The 12 Elder Liches he had leased had been ordered to use summons to keep the Council's forces off balance after the battle at the underway entrance was over. With the way things were now, a dozen 5th-tier summons would wreak unbridled havoc. "Overhear anything useful from the officers while you were out there?" Falagram asked. "The usual things," Velgarth answered. "Figuring out how to outmaneuver the other clans and nursing their grudges when they weren't issuing orders. Things haven't changed much since the last time you were here." "The last time I was here was 50 years before you were born." "Sure, but that doesn't change what I said." Khazanah was as constant and unmoving as the stone formations upon which its principalities were built. The strength and stability that resulted had served the Dark Dwarves well over the centuries, but the new power that had arisen on the surface demanded change. At least the Sorcerer's Kingdom didn't seem all that difficult to keep at bay, at least if one went by the way their human representative presented things. "So," Velgarth said. "Where to next?" "Deepingstone." His daughter's expression soured. "Do we have to?" "It'll be more of a pain if we don't," Falagram told her. "We're short on officers for all of our freed clansmen, too." 30 minutes later, the first set of scouts returned from their investigation of the surrounding city. Falagram called together the Elder Lich sergeants and the few officers that they had freed from the slave trains. "The Council's short-handed," one of the Deep Wardens reported. "Looks like they pulled together everything they had to resist us at the underway exit. The siege works around Deepingstone are all but abandoned." "What's the condition of the hold?" "Untouched, by the looks of it. The Council must have lost a ridiculous number of troops by just trying to get as far as they did. Still, the freed slaves were coming from as far as Hardaway. Assuming that the Council attacked through both underway entrances, it meant that all of Fielhammer had been suppressed outside of the holds." "Any sign of movement from the other half of Fielhammer?" Falagram asked. "The Council probably split their forces not knowing which hole we'd come out of." "My orders were to go about 3 kilometers out," the scout answered. "Law and some of the others are going further." After reassigning the returned scouts to act as screens for the undead, Falagram ordered his forces to march for Deepingstone. As the reconnaissance report had claimed, all that was left of the Council's encirclement was the abandoned siegeworks ringing the fortress. He stared up at the colossal stalagmite and the sprawl of structures embedded in its surface. "Velgarth," he said. "Go and get Deepingstone." "What? Don't watch me. Get your ass moving." His daughter let out an exasperated breath before rendering herself invisible with a psionic field. Not 5 minutes later, the main gate of the hold rolled open. A dark figure dashed out at a startling pace, barreling straight toward him. "Falaboy." Shit. How did he spot me so quickly? He already knew the answer to that. Phalagram glanced at his surroundings. Every dwarf around him had taken at least 5 steps back. He sighed and braced himself. Ei. An uncharacteristically large dwarf with a fiery beard careened forward with arms opened wide. Phalagram received the newcomer with his own greeting, namely flipping him over his shoulder as he came in. Shouts rose from the column as the flying dwarf knocked over a dozen fully armored soldiers before coming to a stop. Hopefully, he's comatose. He had no such luck. The dwarf got back to his feet with a kip-up that belied his rotund form. I knew ye'd come for us, the dwarf said. I didn't come for you, at any rate, Phalagram growled through his beard. Who is this delightful gentleman? The human asked with an insufferably bright smile. Huh? What's that? A mutant? A dire halfling? I'm a human. Phalagram held in a sigh. This was not a pair he wanted to stick together. This is Daerga Deepingstone, he said, Lord of Deepingstone. Clan Feelhammer has the great misfortune of having him and his ilk as kin. Misfortune? The human tilted her head, but he seemed so wonderfully jovial. A birth defect, I assure you. Daerga let out a great guffaw. You get what you pay for, he said before leaning in to speak to the human. Back when my great-grandpappy was still but a squirt in my great-great-grandpappy's bearded ballsack, Clan Feelhammer got it into their heads to go and fuck their cousins. Groans rose from all the dwarves within earshot. The human smile slid straight off of her face. Phalagram wasn't sure what the elder lich at her shoulder was writing down, but he was almost certain that it should be burned. Why your cousins? The human asked in a tentative tone. Aye, our cousins, Daerga answered with a nod. The hill dwarves just to the south of here. They're the best rangers out of all of us dwarves, you see. Clan Feelhammer figured that they could produce superior deep wardens by mixing in some hill dwarf blood. After a bit of raiding and a war that lasted maybe 2 centuries, they got what they were looking for. Not quite, Phalagram muttered. I see, the human said. So that's why your beard is red? All of the dark dwarves I've met so far have had white or grey hair. My beard ain't the only thing that's red, Daerga hooked his thumbs behind his belt. We need to move on, Phalagram told them. Daerga, how many in your hold are battle ready? They're all battle ready, Daerga straightened and saluted. 20,000 of Feelhammer's finest deep wardens await your command, my prince. Once Deepingstone's deep wardens swept across the principality, their reconnaissance would be as perfect as reasonably possible. With them working in conjunction with the undead army, it was simply a matter of time before the council's stooges were eliminated. Law's people will brief your soldiers on the undead and how they operate, Phalagram said. We watched your standoff from here, Daerga cast an eye to the columns of wights and zombies as they made their way past. We weren't sure what the hell they were fighting, but we couldn't believe the sheer volume of steel that they were throwing out. They must have depleted the entire stockpile meant for sieging Feelhammer's holds against you. How'd you survive that? Phalagram gestured to the Death Knights and the human's escort. The ones with the shields here may as well be walking walls, he said. They come with their own healers, so the council was wasting their time with that attack. That so? Well, then, it looks like we have quite the hunt ahead of us. You go on ahead, we'll be overtaking you soon enough. With that, Daerga turned to jog back to his hold, vanishing from sight partway. Phalagram and his escort put Deepingstone behind him, following the undead column southwest to the next hold. Another one of Law's scouts found him on the way there. Report, Phalagram said. We're advancing uncontested, the Deep Warden saluted before falling into step beside him. The council's forces aren't even stopping to lay any traps. Well, that might be because of the crazy buggers those elder liches sent after him. Phalagram glanced at the elder lich sergeant nearby. What did you end up using? He asked. Lesser graveyards, the elder lich answered. We concluded that they were optimal for the scenario. Lesser graveyards, Velgarth murmured. You mean those piles of animated bones that grab people and suck their skeletons out of them? Yes. Nice. Indeed, the elder lich replied dispassionately. Due to the target-rich environment, several of the summons have grown to gargantuan size. On that note, what do you wish to do with the available mass? The available mass? Phalagram frowned. The bones subsumed by graveyard-type undead may be reassembled into various skeletal undead and skeletal constructs. They act as servitors of the graveyard for a limited duration.
Can lesser graveyards make more lesser graveyards?
No.
Well, it was worth a shot.
I'll leave it to the Elder Lich's discretion, Falagrim said. Try to avoid anything that'll cause too much collateral damage. We're the ones cleaning up after this mess, after all. Falagrim's attention returned to the scout.
Any sense for where the council forces are headed?
By the looks of it, sir, Feelhammer Citadel. It'd be the one hold they didn't want to loosen their grip on, so it makes sense that everyone'd end up consolidating with the army there. He grunted and dismissed the scout with a gesture. The idea that invaders were gathering around his seat of power was a displeasing one, but it was convenient for the purpose of exterminating them all at once. As claimed, Deepingstone's soldiers started appearing well before the undead forces arrived at the next hold. Daerga strolled up beside him with a self-assured smile and no sign of any exertion on his part.
So, we're rallying the clan, eh?
I'm surprised you didn't try the same, Falagrim said, given how many troops are at your disposal. The council's numbers are greatly thinned out. Aye, that they are, Daerga nodded. The fools had half our number laying siege to our hold and we even convinced them that they weren't in range of our defenses. But, before we could get started, the council's armies started acting all strange, so we settled in to see what was going on. It was in line with how Deepingstone operated. As a sub-clan of Deep Wardens, they excelled in asymmetrical warfare. The council's forces may have believed that they had Clan Feelhammer contained, but, once Deepingstone broke out, they would end up with a renewed and uniquely brutal battle on their hands. Any idea who the council assigned as the head of their armies? Falagrim asked. We took out Iron Fist back at the underway entrance. If it's not Iron Fist, then my bet's on Dirge Hall.
Dirge Hall?
It's been too quiet here. The only way a clan renowned for its bards could end up on top of the council was if Khazar hadn't seen any major conflict, domestic or otherwise, for an extended period. You don't have to tell me, Daerga grunted. Things now aren't like back in the day when you were still around. They've even gone so far as to seal the passages to the Middle Realms. What?
Yeah.
Supporters of the Holdfast faction sprouted like mushrooms once they did away with you. We haven't had a good war since. It's all about industry and intrigue, now. That was a bad sign. The section of the Middle Realms under Khazar was a place where threats had to be culled on a regular basis. Sooner or later, they would pay for their complacent behavior. Since we're on that topic, Falagrim said. Velgarth said the magnitude of the council's response was far out of line with Ba'owin's expectations. Were their armies meant for something else? That's a good question, Daerga replied. It'd explain how they could respond with such a large punitive force so quickly. But even if that's the case, we haven't caught the slightest whiff of it. Could be that you have, Falagrim told him. Feelhammer's spies reported all sorts of activity, didn't they? Daerga drummed his fingers on his belly with a thoughtful look. So you're saying that what we thought was meant for us was, in reality, meant for someone else? I can't think of any better explanation. Then why didn't they inform us of the threat? If everyone else fights aside from us, that just improves our position over the other principalities militarily. Who knows? You said the Holdfasts have taken over the council. They probably thought they had everything under control. Including us, Daerga chuckled. I don't understand how that can be funny, the human said from behind them. The Lord of Deepingstone looked over his shoulder. A bit of dark dwarf humor, lass, he said. There ain't anything much more satisfying than watching someone scheming bite him in the ass. But doesn't what you're talking about put all of Khazar at risk? Sure, but it doesn't make it any less funny. As the next hold came into view, Falagrim looked beyond it to where the dimly glowing stalactite of Feelhammer Citadel loomed in the distance. It wouldn't be long until they could rip all the answers they wanted out of their enemies' heads.